Spain. The Spanish had been a colonial power in the Caribbean ever since Columbus's first voyage in 1492, when he dropped off several men on Hispaniola to construct their first colony. Fast forward to the golden age of piracy, and the universal monarchy was the dominant power in the region. As soon as Christopher had gotten home, the Pope declared that literally all of the Americas, apart from Brazil, was Spanish territory. They had essentially painted the entire map as theirs, but it wasn't a conventional empire in terms of it directly controlling vast tracts of land. For one, the regions were divided into kingdoms, which were technically in a personal union with the King of Spain, but in reality they were colonies supervised by viceroys. Nor did Spain really control everything within the marked borders. Within them lived hostile tribes, rogue encampments of foreign traders, pirates and colonists, and the Spanish colonies were more so a number of interconnected nodes, erected for the harvest of local resources such as gold, silver, and luxury plantation items like chocolate, dyestuffs, cotton, sugar, and tobacco. All of these nodes were tied together by the treasure fleet, or galleons, that annually traveled between them. Firstly, the Manila galleon traveled from the Philippines across the Pacific to Mexico. At Acapulco, the goods were dropped off and shipped overland to Veracruz. From Peru, silver was shipped to Panama. The galleons then went to Havana, Veracruz, Panama, and back to Spain, dropping off European goods in return for the New World treasures. The treasure fleet had a few flaws. One might think that it was susceptible to capture by enemy privateers, but the galleons traveled in huge fleets with armed protection, and was only ever captured a handful of times, most famously by Piet Hein in 1628. A few isolated galleons got captured here and there, including the Manila galleons. The biggest threat was nature itself, as isolated galleons or even entire fleets could get lost in the terrible storms of the region. Lost galleons often led to even more trouble, as they attracted pirates and salvagers searching for easy loot. It is as they say, it is much easier to rob from the dead. The most notable example is probably the loss of the entire treasure fleet in 1715, when it was wrecked on the shores of Florida. This kickstarted the last great surge of piracy in the Golden Age, as hundreds of ex-privateers flocked to fish the wrecks. Other famous wrecks include the Maravillas in the Bahamas, which gave rise to a substantial pirate community. The 1641 Almirante of the treasure fleet, Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, was recovered by William Phipps in 1686. Even though Spain benefited immensely from her colonies, the empire was always overextended, and managing the vast empire proved difficult, especially when focus had to be put on the conflicts in Europe. This made the Spanish colonies susceptible not only to piratical raids, but also to smugglers. Spain had the idea that no one was allowed to trade with her colonies, nor that the individual colonies should trade with each other outside of the treasure fleet. This created a huge demand for, well, basically everything, which could only be satisfied by smugglers. The smugglers, in turn, were hungry for the exotic goods produced by the Spanish colonies, and when they couldn't do contraband for whatever reason, they turned to piracy instead. The golden age of piracy was first and foremost caused by bad economic policy, as we'll see throughout the video. One of the most desired goods in the Spanish colonies were slaves. Initially, the Spanish had enslaved or forced into serfdom the native inhabitants, but after many of them died from disease, they had to be supplanted by African slave labor. However, Spanish and Portuguese ships alone were often insufficient in satisfying the huge labor demand, so pirates and smugglers had to fill in the gaps. Some people believe that the pirates of the late Golden Age liberated slaves from the ships they captured. No, they just sold them illegally and it wasn't documented because it was illegal. Many of them in New Spain and Portuguese Brazil. Out of all the colonial powers, the Spanish were definitely the most diverse. White Spaniards formed a very small minority, with most of the colonial subjects being indigenous, African, or mixed. Anyone that could convert to Catholicism was fine. Indigenous auxiliaries, often armed with bows and arrows, formed a huge part of the Spanish defense against pirates. Overall, however, Spanish defenses were quite poor. In the first half of the 17th century, they relied upon dated fortifications and old armories with antiquated weaponry. Firearms were relatively few and far between, and often of poor quality or altogether broken. However, the Spanish did excel in melee combat with their lances, and their cavalry were exceptional. This included both melee cavalry armed with lances and elite dragoons equipped with high-quality firearms. After the Buccaneer rampage of the 1660s, Spain began investing more heavily into its fortifications and colonial defenses. A local solution was the Guarda Costa, or Coast Guard. These were local captains given a commission and command of a small vessel, usually a big canoe or a small galley. Consisting of ambitious minorities and international renegades, the Garda would capture pirate ships, interlopers, smugglers, or even honest merchants, treating them with the utmost cruelty, and often behaving little better than pirates themselves. In the end, the Garda did little more than perpetuate the Caribbean cycle of bloodshed, in which revenge was met by revenge, was met by revenge. Still, the Spanish Empire survived the golden age of piracy. As the 18th century progressed, liberal reforms opened up the colonies to freer trade, eventually leading to the abolishment of the treasure fleet in 1790. El Escorial continued to reap the fruits of her colonies right up until 1808, when Napoleon occupied the home country and the colonies declared their independence, reducing the empire to just Cuba. Today, Spain draws in a significant labor force from her former colonies and holds a notable financial sway in many of them, aside from maintaining good trade relations owing to the shared language and history. On today's episode of What Are We Drinking? That's a sweet sound, isn't it? Today we're drinking cognac. And I also got a cup of tea because why not? You know you got a sweet job when you can drink during working hours. Alright, let's have a little sip here. Ooh. Cough and varnish. Let's have some tea to wash it down. England. England would rise to become the second largest colonial power of the Caribbean, owing to her increased focus on international commerce and naval power. And the Caribbean colonies, although small, would form the wealthiest epicenter of the empire well into the 20th century. However, this was far from guaranteed in the early 17th century. English sailors had been present in the Caribbean since the 16th century, though only as pirates and smugglers. It wasn't until 1624 that the first English colony appeared on the island of St. Christopher. Their early colonial policy can best be described as chaotic. It was entirely grassroots, by entrepreneurs seeking a quick and easy buck. They thought they could go to the Caribbean, steal a few Spanish ships, dig some gold, find El Dorado or some precious tobacco, and return home rich. Few of them did. After St. Christopher came Barbados, both islands being used to grow tobacco. In the 1630s up until the 50s, the English also competed with the Spanish and French to build a tobacco colony on Tortuga. However, overinvestment into tobacco led to a price collapse, turning the once imagined cash crop into a poor investment for the rest of the century. And crucially, the Dutch would introduce sugar and the machinery to process it, leading to the growth of the plantation industry in the Lesser Antilles. Though initially powered by indentured servants from Europe, African slaves were soon found to be more reliable. These were either sourced directly from Africa, either by sponsored companies or smugglers, or simply stolen from other slave ships or Spanish colonies by, you guessed it, pirates. When Oliver Cromwell took control over England, he made a more direct investment into colonial policy, sending over a fleet in 1655 to conquer Hispaniola. The expedition was a disaster, but they managed to take Jamaica instead. This is really where England's Caribbean empire kicked off. The young colony was quite poorly managed by military governors, with early Jamaica being little more than a base for buccaneers, many of them commanded by officers from Europe. Here it must be noted that a majority of English governors throughout the empire were not from the lower classes. In the Puritan colonies, it was primarily educated clergymen. In the non-Puritan colonies, it was primarily land-owning aristocrats or accomplished military men. I only know of one case where a former pirate was made governor, and I think that was in the early 18th century. this doesn't mean that the governors were afraid to get their hands dirty, quite the opposite. English colonial governors were, as governors often were, corrupt, and unashamedly made deals with pirates and smugglers, both to enrich themselves and their colonies. Jamaica began to flourish under the governance of Thomas Modiford, one of the first successful sugar planters from Barbados. He not only made good dealings with buccaneers, most prominently Henry Morgan, but also made a significant investment into the sugar industry, kick-starting the economy that would make Jamaica Britain's most valuable colony, at least until the acquisition of India. However, after 1670, Jamaica began cracking down on buccaneers, and the island had to find new venues of making money. Piracy would continue to some degree, but was largely supplanted by smuggling and logwood cutting. The logwood trade was largely run by a group of semi-piratical lumberjacks called the Baymen. Named after the Bay of Campeche, in which they operated, they were former buccaneers who lived in small camps and harvested the precious dye. Ships from New England or elsewhere would come and buy the wood for tools, food, and especially liquor. Even though the Baymen were trespassing on Spanish property, they would eventually carve out a colony in what is now Belize. The Puritans had constructed stable colonies in what is now the United States, but they were less successful in the Caribbean. Their base on Santa Catalina was retaken by the Spanish, and Tortuga was eventually lost to the French. Their only successful settlement was in the Bahamas, when Puritan refugees from Bermuda constructed the town of Eleuthera, spreading afterwards to the remaining islands. They were a poor and humble lot who lived in huts and sustained themselves on salt raking and turtle fishing. Their speciality was salvaging shipwrecks for building materials and more, and pirates were soon drawn to the islands by the aforementioned shipwreck of the Maravillas. New Providence became a noted pirate hideout, even though it was destroyed at multiple points in the 17th century. Its most notable stint as a pirate base was in the 1710s, when it became the home of an organization of pirates and salvagers called the Flying Gang. The English had entered the Caribbean to trade with the Spanish and turned to smuggling and piracy owing to poor Spanish trade policy. Ironically, the English would fall into the same trap as their rivals, which would have even more severe consequences when they lost their American colonies. But I'm getting ahead of myself. During the 17th century, most countries operated under the economic policy of mercantilism, which basically said that internal trade was good, export was good, and importing was bad. Nations sought to restrict free trade as much as possible. So when Westminster noticed that their colonies were trading heavily with the French and Dutch, they got jealous and introduced the Navigation Acts in 1651, and partly because England and the Netherlands had a bit of a dispute, as in, they were shooting at each other with cannons. Ouch. But as we could see with the Spanish trade policy, forbidding trade it didn't actually do anything, and it did more harm than it did good. It didn't stop people from trading with other nations, they just started doing it illegally, and suddenly you lost a potential revenue source. Not only did it foster smuggling, but also piracy. If we can't acquire the goods we want, we'll just take them. When pirates started turning on the English or rival colonies, this was largely a consequence of the Navigation Acts. And this wasn't even the worst extent of it. Economic restrictions fostered bad relations between crown and colony, and along with increased taxes, led to the American Revolution. England differed from Spain in its treatment of indigenous peoples. For the most part, they went by the rule of enemy of my enemy is my friend. Tribes that were hostile to the Spanish, such as the Cuna and Mosquito, were sought out as trade partners and allies. Also convenient that they were comfortably far away from English territory, because the tribes that were within the Red Border seldom had a good time. The Carib were entirely wiped out from St. Christopher, turning them against the English for the rest of the century. Carib raiders would muster fleets of canoes and raid English settlements, killing the men and taking away the women, children, and slaves. Instead, the Carib found a convenient ally in the French. Alright, let's see if we can turn on the harpsichord and get that sound effect. France. The French Caribbean Empire was in many ways similar to the English, but differed in several crucial aspects. Overall, French colonial policy was more thought out, sophisticated, and methodical. It didn't always work out, a bit of trial and error, but eventually it did, and they largely came out the winner of the 17th century struggle for the colonies. France wasn't toppled as a colonial power until the early 18th century, and that was because, much like Spain, they had to divert their attention to matters at home. Nonetheless, the French Caribbean Empire would remain immensely profitable, so much so that Napoleon was willing to give away all of Louisiana if it meant just keeping the tiny colony of Saint-Domingue. Looks can be deceiving. French corsairs and smugglers had penetrated into the Americas earlier than the English. Notably, they captured one of the first treasure ships and sacked the city of Havana, an action never to be repeated by pirates. By the early 17th century, French smugglers and hunters had a heavy presence on the western coast of Hispaniola, called Saint-Domingue, where they traded illegally with the Spanish, harvested Brazil wood, and hunted game for their skins. The French Caribbean Empire began in 1625, when a pirate named Pierre de Esnambuc made landfall on St. Christopher after being beaten back by a Spanish galleon. The English had already set up a colony on the island and were more than glad to help the pirate out, who in turn saw great potential in growing tobacco in this place. Leaving some subordinates behind to manage the nascent French colony, Desnambuc brought some of the fragrant leaves back to France as evidence of colonial potential, where he managed to earn an investment from Cardinal Richelieu. This high-standing clergyman was currently looking to expand France's naval power, including her colonial possessions. St. Christopher sounded like a great beginning. Already at the inception of the French Caribbean Empire, we get a gist of her policy. Private, often pirate, initiative, backed by state power. Unlike the English, the French government, even the monarch himself, would be more directly invested in colonial affairs, and they would be unafraid to work directly with pirates, and even promote some of them to positions of supreme authority, and with great success. Inspired by the Dutch, Richelieu envisioned colonies managed by great trading companies, where merchants were encouraged to invest their capital by offering them special privileges, such as freedom of custom duties or exclusive trading rights in specified localities. So when Desnambuc arrived with his proposal, the Company of St. Christopher was born. The company was responsible for recruiting and sending over new settlers and servants, along with much-needed supplies. The early colonies were far from self-sufficient. In return, they took the proceeds from the plantations. It seemed like a decent enough system, but it often fell on its arse when the company was unable to meet the needs of the settlers. These needs then had to be filled by independent traders, usually the Dutch. The settlers' reliance on the Dutch then decreased the profits of the company, and the interests of the settlers versus the company would clash for the rest of the century. In a few cases, this culminated in flat-out mutinies. In 1635, the Company of St. Christopher's proved a failure, and Richelieu had it replaced with the Company of the Isles of America, which held more authority and likewise incorporated neighboring islands for settlement. With this new project came a greater ambition to Christianize the islands, and various monastic orders like the Capuchins were sent overseas to establish missions. And traveling French priests such as du Tertre and Labat have been instrumental in providing us with a history of the region. The dream was to have the French Caribbean be a Catholic haven, free of Huguenot influence. This didn't really work out, and efforts were likewise made to convert the Carib, who were made a French ally against the English. Any Indian who made a profession of faith was allowed to become a French subject. The religious influence took a different turn when a Knight of Malta, Philippe de Poissy, was appointed as the new governor of the Isles. In spite of dressing himself and his guardsmen in the chivalrous garb of this ancient order, Poissy was a bit of a scalawag, having been idling in Paris after a dispute with the Archbishop of Bordeaux. He constructed himself a stone castle as his residence, and it would have significant architectural influence in the rest of France's colonies, as would the knightly order. Some of its members would, ironically, lead piratical expeditions against the Spanish, their fellow Catholics. While the company was expanding its holdings in the Lesser Antilles, a loose organization called the Brethren of the Coast had cropped up on the western coast of Hispaniola, or Saint-Domingue. These were independent tobacco farmers, hunters, and pirates that eked out a humble existence in their coastal camps. Among them were international smugglers that traded both with them and the Spanish, and the Brethren would sometimes rob from or trade with ships indiscriminately. The Brethren had an organized base on the island of Tortuga, constantly fought over between the English, Spanish, and French. In 1664, the island was finally acquired by the French West India Company. Wait, a new company? Yes. The Company of the Isles of America was disbanded in 1664 after the death of Philippe de Poissy. The government realized that the previous company had given too much authority to its governors, and had been unable to prevent trade with the Dutch. Thus was established a new, more centralized company, the French West India Company, with the goal of gradually shutting off all trade with foreigners. By now, it must also be mentioned that Louis XIV had matured into adulthood and was personally invested in the development of the American colonies. He allegedly had a mistress who had been to the region and met the buccaneers, quote-unquote met, and he was always salivating for stories from the piratical adventurers. Some of them he would personally welcome to his court, especially as they came carrying great booty, even though he was a close follower of Richelieu's policy. It was fine to appoint buccaneers to positions of power and generally allow them to have a bit of fun, but ultimately, they were doing it for the profit of France, and they had to obey the state. The buccaneers didn't always agree. As for the West India Company, it was disbanded in 1674 after monetary troubles. Versailles dropped all pretenses and annexed the Caribbean colonies under its direct control. As governor of Tortuga, the company appointed Bertrand d'Orgeron, a buccaneer who had attempted to build colonies across Saint-Domingue. He was one of the region's most energetic governors, and succeeded in expanding the crown's possessions from Tortuga to the rest of the coast. However, rapid expansion came at a cost, as the territory within the borders remained sparsely settled until the end of the century. Between then and now, Saint-Domingue largely remained a massive pirate stronghold. Most of the population were pirates or former pirates, always active in plundering forays against the Spanish. This brought in much needed wealth, both cash and slaves, used in expanding the sugar industry. Whilst the French knew how reliant they were on the buccaneers, they also knew how free-spirited and troublesome these scoundrels could be. Attempts were continuously and slowly made to reel in their autonomy, ranging from hunting restrictions to taking their guns, and of course, bans on free trade. This often resulted in armed uprisings. Nonetheless, by using both carrot and stick, France was successfully able to reel in its massive piratical elements, and by the end of the century, Saint-Domingue had achieved a perfect balance between sugar production and naval base. At the turn of the century, France and Spain made a sudden U-turn by becoming allies, and even edging towards a personal union. Suddenly, the once closed-off Spanish markets were now broadly open, and buccaneers who had once hunted Spanish treasure fleets were now escorting them. Even though France had the restrictive trade policies of England and Spain, their alliance with the Spanish opened up Spanish markets, and their ability to accept pirates into government and landed positions, aside from giving them ample job opportunities, meant that the French largely avoided having their privateers turn to piracy in the 1710s, unlike the English, except for a few side cases. Saint-Domingue would remain an immensely profitable colony owing to its sugar production, but this at the cost of severely abusing its enslaved workforce. Talk shit, get hit. The white settlers were butchered in the Haitian Revolution, when the Saint-Domingue slaves rose up and declared their own empire. Napoleon, recognizing the immense value of the colony, rolled back the abolition of slavery and sent expeditions to recover the coast. But it wasn't to be, and the French Caribbean Empire had been reduced to the original small islands in the Lesser Antilles. Blood was paid by blood, and Haiti remains a troublesome region, a horrifying echo of the colonial period and its piratical past. Sit down here. Alright. It's been about 2 hours since I started the recording, so I guess it's time for our second shot of the old coffin varnish. Alright, here we go. Burns right on the way down. Probably good medicine. Portugal. When the Pope divvied up the world between Spain and Portugal at the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Portuguese didn't exactly receive the lion's cut of the Americas, and not 1 inch of the Caribbean. This doesn't mean that the Portuguese didn't have a Caribbean presence, even if minor. Naturally, the Spanish Empire was diverse, and Portuguese sailors, agents and merchants often ended up in Spanish colonies, ship crews, etc. Portuguese ships did on occasion trade in the Caribbean, and pirates and traders often went down to Brazil, which belonged to Portugal. A lot of early buccaneers likewise operated under Portuguese commissions when attacking the Spanish, since Portugal was fighting its war of independence against Spain between 1640 and 1668, a fourth of the golden age of piracy. The Netherlands. The Dutch presence in the Caribbean is very interesting. Out of all the major colonial powers, their Caribbean empire was the smallest by far, consisting only of a few islands. Nonetheless, the Dutch had a significant impact on the development of the region and its history. The early history of the Dutch in the Caribbean is similar to the French and English. They entered in the early 16th century as corsairs looking to pirate and smuggle, part of a wider project to undermine the Spanish. The Dutch were fighting an independence war against Spain between 1566 and 1648. Throughout the 1630s, the Dutch acquired multiple tiny islands in the Lesser Antilles, and in 1634, the island of Curaçao close to Venezuela. These islands shouldn't be seen as conventional colonies as much as trading posts for interacting with the colonies of everyone else. The Dutch realized very quickly that their meager population wouldn't be able to swarm and settle the Caribbean, nor would it be successful, pleasant, or especially popular. Instead, it was more economically viable to trade with everyone else. Impressively, the Dutch traders thought in the long term, and figured that by investing in everyone else's colonies, they could earn back their losses in the future. So when the English and French colonies in the Antilles were starving, unclothed, and desperate, the Dutch came in and offered them supplies at severely cut rates, often allowing payment on credit. The French colony on St. Christopher would probably have perished had it not been for the Dutch coming to rescue them with flour, meat, clothing, and wine. In return, the Dutch were given harvests of tobacco. Blaze it up, boys. As aforementioned, tobacco prices plummeted in the early 17th century and would never recover. The Dutch recognized that tobacco wasn't in the future and looked for new avenues to profit. In 1630, the Dutch invaded and occupied parts of northern Brazil. With the colonizers came a painter named Frans Post, who made tens if not hundreds of astonishing artworks of the Brazilian environment, its people, architecture, and especially sugar plantations. It was from the occupied Portuguese that the Dutchmen learned the inner workings of a sugar plantation and refinery, and the immense potential for profit. Taking sugar cane and the necessary machinery, the Dutch began introducing the crop and its techniques to the French and English of the Lesser Antilles. It was with Holland their assistance that these two nations adopted the white gold. By now, the Dutch maintained storehouses and trading offices in virtually every French and English colony. Dutch influence can clearly be seen on this print of Bridgetown, Barbados, in 1695. Notice the style on some of the roof gables, clearly influenced by architecture in Amsterdam. A subtle reminder of the considerable sway the Hollanders had in the development of the Caribbean empires. The sugar trade was brutal, and after white servants proved inferior at working the fields and refineries, they were soon replaced en masse by African slaves. Naturally, the Dutch were some of the most frequent suppliers. In 1648, when Spain and the Netherlands finally signed a peace treaty, the attitude between them shifted from conflict to commerce. The Dutch became Spain's #1 supplier of ships, and in 1671 were granted the Asiento de Negros, a monopoly on slave trading with Spain's colonies. A few other nations could compete with the Dutch in commercial expertise, and jealous eyes soon began to covet the riches made by the red, white, and blue. Both the French and English wanted their own colonies to trade with them, not with the Dutch, especially since both of them tended to fight with the Dutch in all-out war. England passed the Navigation Acts in 1651, banning trade with the Dutchmen. The French made several colonial laws restricting Dutch trade, sometimes leading to armed revolt, often instigated by Dutch merchants. It wasn't like the Dutch were especially discouraged by these restrictions. When they couldn't trade legally with the colonies, they traded illegally instead. Contraband, smuggling, and interloping. interloper was synonymous with a Dutch ship in the colonial period, and they were much reviled by the authorities, but loved by common colonials for their generous prices. This made the Dutch both allies and targets of pirates. Since Dutch slave traders were aligned with the Spanish, they often made for convenient targets. But the Dutch could always be relied upon if you wanted to sell your questionably acquired goods without any questions. With the great power shift in the late 17th century, the Netherlands lost the Asiento to the French, and then to the English in 1713 with the end of the War of Spanish Succession. The Dutch would continue their smuggling antics, operating closely with the pirates of Nassau. The Cockram family of the Bahamas, closely connected to Benjamin Hornigold, leader of the Flying Gang, maintained a smuggling network with ties to Curaçao. The island is still part of the Netherlands, though I doubt they still engage in either piracy or smuggling. Did Italy have any colonial presence in the Caribbean? Italy did not become a unified power until the mid-19th century. In the early modern age, the region was divided between multiple smaller states, some of them city-states with substantial navies and commercial power. Venice and Genoa were two of the most significant. The former put all of its focus to the east, whereas the latter did have a slight presence in the New World. Christopher Columbus himself was Genoan, and the continent itself was named after Amerigo Vespucci, from the Republic of Florence. Fast forward to the 17th century, and Genoa had become a Spanish satellite state, but with few complaints from its urban merchants, who now had access to the valuable markets of the Spanish Empire. Genoese trade posts were maintained in major colonial cities such as Panama, and between 1662 and 1671 they held the aforementioned Asiento, monopoly on trading slaves with Spain. However, the Genoese were often assisted, illegally mind you, by the English and Dutch, so it's no surprise that the monopoly was passed to the tulip lovers in 71. The Genoese remained a minor player in Caribbean affairs. Denmark. It may come as a shock or surprise that the Danish had a bigger influence in the colonial Caribbean than Italians and Germans. Now, Denmark could be considered Europe's oldest colonial and even American power, since they controlled Greenland in the late Middle Ages, though the Norse colony there disappeared shortly after. Throughout the 17th century, Denmark expanded its colonial holdings in Africa and India. From the Danish Gold Coast, slaves were exported to the Caribbean colonies of the other powers. It wasn't until 1672 that Denmark decided to dip its own toe in the Caribbean pot, when it acquired a small island of St. Thomas after several failed attempts. The plan was of course to erect a plantation economy, but money wouldn't just come out of nowhere, so the Danish governor soon made a radical decision to make St. Thomas a free port, meaning that any and all ships were allowed to enter, without having to pay any special taxes or custom dues. Not only did it make St. Thomas a hub of free trade, but also a nest for pirates. Here would come notorious scalawags like Bartholomew Sharp and John Hamlin, some of the biggest crooks from the period. On some occasions, the governors would even defend harbored pirates from enemy navies, sheltering them beneath the guns of the fort. The riotous nature of St. Thomas continued until around 1684, when privateering commissions were no longer issued by its governor. Bartholomew Sharp was arrested there in 1700 after attempting to flee his debts, and he died in prison on the island, where his own ship had burned down 16 years prior. Since Danish traders were just about everywhere in the world, from the Americas to Africa to Asia, they were often targets of pirates, and could often be found aboard pirate ships. Henry Every both fought against Denmark and employed Danish sailors in his expedition to the Red Sea. St. Thomas continued as a slave-powered sugar colony until the abolition of slavery in 1848, surprisingly late. The island was acquired by the United States in 1917, and so ended the Danish Caribbean Empire. Germany. Much like Italy, Germany wasn't a unified region in the early modern age, but divided among multiple smaller states. Some of them did maintain trade contacts with the Caribbean, but not enough to hold any colonies or trade offices worth mentioning. The city of Hamburg, having a long history as a commercial hub, seems to have maintained the most trade contacts with the Caribbean. One of the Caribbean goods delivered to Hamburg was logwood, harvested by the aforementioned baymen, or pirate lumberjacks. German privateers did have a temporary presence in the Caribbean. During the 1670s, the Spanish had incurred a heavy debt with the Prince Elector of Brandenburg, which would later become Prussia. The prince, having overseas ambitions of his own, decided to issue letters of reprisal to claim the debt by force. Hiring a small fleet of Dutch privateers and giving their ships German names, such as Der Kurprinz, Roter Löwe, Fuchs, and Berlin, the Brandenburg privateers set off to the Americas. Already taking the first prize of France, they proceeded to rampage across the Spanish Caribbean. In 1680, Henry Morgan gave them access to Port Royal, where they sold their prize ships. Afterwards, they successfully returned to Prussia. Brandenburg managed to establish a small colony on the West African coast in 1681, and their ships would continue to visit the West Indies, many of them trading at St. Thomas. After Great Britain entered into a union with the German state of Hanover in the 1710s, a small number of German settlers likewise accompanied Woodes Rogers when he reclaimed New Providence from the pirates. Sweden. Similar to Denmark, Sweden had colonial ambitions, but never met with as much success as their southern neighbor. For a while they maintained quite a successful colony in what is now Pennsylvania, but it was later conquered by the Dutch and then the English. Known as New Sweden, Swedish privateers did sail from thence to the Caribbean in the 40s and 50s, bringing home a small number of slaves. One of the supply ships from back home was likewise captured by the Spanish in the West Indies and severely abused. A Swedish presence on the Gold Coast likewise meant that Swedes could be found aboard slave ships, traders, and multiple pirate vessels. Swedes were found in the crews of Sam Bellamy and Richard Taylor, but they never seem to have been as prominent as the Danish. It wasn't until 1784 that Gustav III personally acquired the island of St. Barthélemy, operating it as a slave-powered sugar colony. It was sold back to France 100 years later. Latvia? The strangest Caribbean colonial empire is probably the one maintained by Kurland, a German-ruled duchy in what is now Latvia. Under the rule of Jacob Kettler between 1642 and 1682, Kurland became a surprisingly powerful state, maintaining a strong merchant fleet and economic presence in Europe. And Kettler soon began to look even further abroad to expand the power of the country. Coronian ships had penetrated into the Caribbean several years before his reign and attempted to establish colonies without any success. In 1654, a Coronian colony was finally established on the island of Tobago. A hard struggle was ahead for the small nation, with most of their opposition coming from the Dutch, who established a rival colony on the island. It would eventually overshadow the Coronian colony, but goods of value were still exported back home. However, Spanish retaliation soon spelled the demise of the colony. Sporadic attempts were made to resettle the island up until 1690, when it was finally abandoned. The surviving settlers either joined the buccaneers or their English allies. Interesting to know would be the Latvian element among the Coronian settlers, partly because I'm half Latvian myself. Latvians were generally suppressed by their German overlords and forced into serfdom, and it seems that most of the settlers were Baltic German. So ended the strangest colonial empire of the Caribbean.